I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing today before this subcommittee. Many have traveled a very long way to get here, and we very much appreciate that. This morning we're going to talk about the National Marine Sanctuary Act, which grants the Secretary of Commerce the authority to designate areas of additional restriction and management over areas in America's oceans and Great Lakes that bear unique conservation, cultural, or historic significance. While the concept of national marine sanctuaries is well-intentioned, many of these protected areas have caused some challenges for coastal and Great Lakes communities across the country that are dependent upon the abundant resources found in America's waters. Recognizing these concerns, President Trump recently issued an executive order that pauses the Secretary from issuing any new designations and instituting a review of current sanctuaries. Just last week, NOAA initiated a public comment period for this review. Now, marine sanctuaries vary in size, with some less than 1 square mile and others that exceed 6,000 square miles. Today, sanctuaries encompass more than 600,000 square miles. Similar to the Antiquities Act, the National Marine Sanctuary Act is one of the few laws that allows for unilateral and restrictive conservation designations solely by the executive branch. This is an extraordinary power. Designating national parks, forests, wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, and other conservation areas all typically require congressional action and, of course, stakeholder input, which encourages an open and public process that takes local views into account, an important element and subtopic of today's hearing. In 2014, NOAA reestablished a process by which individuals and entities may nominate areas for consideration as a national marine sanctuary. The criteria for areas that are eligible to become a national marine sanctuary is considerably broad. Since then, a multitude of nominations have been submitted. This is of serious concern given the limited resources we currently have available to manage these areas. As new areas are designated, existing resources are stretched ever thinner. The Sanctuary Act wisely recognized this potential pitfall and includes language that prohibits the creation of new sanctuaries if their establishment would threaten the management efforts of other sanctuaries. Another aspect of the sanctuary designation and establishment process that I look forward to hearing about in today's hearing is NOAA's consideration of the views of the public, local communities, and existing management bodies such as the councils under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. The Sanctuary Act requires stakeholder engagement, but has no stipulation that any of it be taken into consideration. This can lead to communities who are most impacted by these designations feeling betrayed by the agency when established sanctuaries are unrecognizable to the very communities that spent years working to form a mutually beneficial designation and management structure. In addition, the National Marine Sanctuaries designation process gives NOAA virtually limitless authority to outline the regulations that apply in these sanctuaries. Among other things, National Marine Sanctuaries establish duplicative regulations that can limit sustainable and economically beneficial commercial and recreational fishing, usurping the authority of existing management entities such as Regional Fisheries Management Council, as I already mentioned, that have established authority under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. When this happens, the protection of America's precious marine resources is taken out of the hands of the very institutions and experts who have so successfully managed these resources for generations. Since enactment in 1972, the Sanctuary Act has been reauthorized 6 times, most recently in 2000. That was over 17 years ago. Today we will hear from some of the user groups and communities about challenges and deficiencies in the designation and management of sanctuaries. I know their expertise and experiences will help guide us to make sure if we have any beneficial changes to the program, It includes more effective, efficient, and responsive ways in which to engage local communities who were impacted the most. I want to recognize Senator Peters for his focus on this issue as well, and recognize him for any opening statement he might have. Senator Peters.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing together, and I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for making the time to come before us today and testify. I know many of you had to travel a great distance to be here, and that effort is very much appreciated. Sanctuaries are very dear and near to my heart, as well as to Michigan's economy. And I think we have a really good story to tell about the Thunder Bay Sanctuary in my state. In fact, I received a note from a fellow Michigander yesterday that I'd like to have entered into the record. His name is Stephen Kroll. He runs a charter operation out of Rogers Cities, Michigan, and he urges in the letter for us to maintain the expansion of the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. In fact, in that letter he writes, and I quote, "There has been a steady increase in our area of new businesses. Even where I live, 40 miles north of Alpena in the expanded area, empty storefront buildings are being occupied with new businesses, and we are seeing growth again," end of quote. The economic boom has been tremendous in my state. In 2005, even before there was an expansion of the sanctuary, counties surrounding the old boundaries of the sanctuary garnered $100 million in sales related to Thunder Bay. This generated $39 million in personal income to residents and about 1,700 jobs. Last year, I had the great pleasure to scuba dive on Shipwreck Alley, which is in Thunder Bay Sanctuary. And the cold, clear fresh water preserves these shipwrecks dating back to the 19th century in basically pristine condition. There's nothing like getting up close to them, and it's an experience that once somebody has that opportunity, we'll never forget. In fact, the one ship I dove on, as we were approaching it, you couldn't see it, and then it came in to your view, and it was like a ghost ship that had just dropped on the bottom of the lake. It was a miraculous vision to see. But you don't have to be a certified diver to see firsthand these incredible pieces of American history. We have glass-bottom boats that allow you to stay dry, but still have a close-up view of these beautiful national treasures, some of which are only a few feet underneath the surface. This trove of artifacts has formed the basis for developing world-class historical and archaeological research programs centered around the sanctuary. In addition to the jobs and dollars infused into the local economy, Thunder Bay serves as an educational and historical treasure that preserves 110 known shipwrecks that document over 200 years of maritime history. Thunder Bay has been so successful, I'm happy to say, that now our neighbors in Wisconsin want a sanctuary of their own, and they have been working the grassroots process to make that a reality. But I will say it always wasn't this way. Back in 1997, the city of Alpena, in fact, actually passed a referendum opposing the sanctuary. And true to the construct and intent of the Sanctuaries Act, NOAA did not force the sanctuary on the locals. Instead, NOAA, the state, the city of Alpena, and the Sanctuary Advisory Council came to the negotiating table, and they worked for 3 years to find a consensus before moving forward. NOAA made changes to the regulations for Thunder Bay to make them more consistent with existing state laws. Then Secretary of Commerce Bill Daley was quoted as saying, and I quote, "The sanctuary will only succeed with the support of the state and the local community," end of quote. And I think Secretary Daley was right. And since the 2000 designation of Thunder Bay, it has become without question one of the crown jewels of Michigan's tourism industry today. So I'm looking forward to hearing the testimony today. We have witnesses like Captain Hickman, who are going through the arduous process that it takes to get it right when it comes to managing sanctuaries in a way that has community support. We have before us stakeholders like Captain O'Brien and Mr. Weiss, who have concerns about possible new designations, and we have before us Admiral Lautenbacher, who has seen the diversity of the 13 sanctuaries that protect right now roughly about 1% of U.S. ocean waters. And if sanctuaries are not the right fit, I want to go on the record, if they're not the right fit in other places, we would like to have them in the Great Lakes. And so we will take those sanctuaries as much as we can in my area. And in the same vein, the committee has received also numerous letters of support for today's hearing from community leaders of a variety of sanctuaries all across the country. And I would ask Mr. Chairman, that those letters could be entered into the record, as well as Mr. Kroll's letter that I referenced.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll turn this back to the chairman and look forward to the testimony of our witnesses.
Well, thank you, Senator Peters, and I want to again thank the witnesses. I also want to give you a context of what's going on with health care and marking up a number of bills on armed services. I can guarantee you there's a lot of member interest in this topic. Hopefully we're going to have other members here. There's just a lot going on in the Senate this morning, and so there's hopefully going to be a little bit of in and out. But that does not take away from our appreciation for the witnesses here, many of whom I think it's safe to say traveled not just hours, but in some cases days to get here. We have Mr. Ernest Weiss, the Natural Resources Director from the Aleutian East Borough in the great state of Alaska, one of my constituents. He has an excellent background of providing the residents of the borough, which hopefully Mr. Weiss will describe in a little bit more detail, because it's quite a unique place in America with representation of various fisheries, advisory, and management bodies. And he assists in the development and implementation of scientific efforts and regulations, and is importantly and currently a member of the advisory panel on the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. Mr. Weiss, welcome. Captain Scott Hickman, who's the owner of Circle H Outfitters in Galveston, Texas, and a recipient of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation Volunteer of the Year Award. Captain Jeremiah O'Brien, the past president of Murrow Bay Commercial Fishermen's Association, and Vice Admiral Conrad Lautenbacher, who was the previous NOAA administrator from 2001 through 2008. So a very distinguished panel. I again want to welcome them. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver an oral opening statement, and a longer written statement, if you so choose, will be included for the record. Why don't we begin, sir, with you, Mr. Weiss.
Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Peters, thank you for the opportunity. I work for the Aleutian East Borough, which is on the Alaska Peninsula and encompasses also the easternmost Aleutian Islands. Our southern coast opens to the western Gulf of Alaska, and our northern shores on the Bristol Bay and the Bering Sea. Our 6 communities are dependent on access to the abundant marine resources. There are no roads connecting our communities or to the rest of Alaska. All travel is by air or by sea. Our local fishermen work on these waters nearly all year round. Right now they're fishing for salmon, but later on they'll fish for cod, halibut, crab, pollock. Our borough fishermen are regulars now at the management processes at the Alaska Board of Fisheries for state waters fisheries and the North Pacific Fishery Management Council for fisheries in federal waters. Both of these management bodies use excellent scientific methods and a rigorous public process. The North Pacific Council uses ecosystem-based management and has put in place substantial marine protections in Alaskan waters. Over 95% of the Aleutian Islands management area is closed to bottom trawl to minimize impacts to the bottom and the essential fish habitat. Stellar sea lion protections are in place. In the Arctic, nearly 150,000 square nautical miles are closed to all fishing until there's better scientific data available. There's closures to bottom contact gear in place to protect coral gardens, and other closures to trawl and bottom trawl to protect crab and rockfish habitat. The council process in the North Pacific is working to protect our marine resources. There's currently no national marine sanctuaries in Alaska, but in 2014, the nomination process was reestablished, and that process mandates that community-based development of a nomination. And that's great. Any nomination should start with the local community, but the final rule states communities in this context are defined as a collection of interested individuals or groups. We believe that communities that are adjacent to a proposed sanctuary with the potential to be the most impacted should be the drivers of any new sanctuary nomination. Aleutians East Borough got involved in this process in December of 2014 when the group Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, based in Washington, D.C., proposed the Aleutian Island National Marine Sanctuary, a massive 554,000 nautical square miles, an area larger than the landmass of the state of Alaska. It would have encompassed all the Aleutian, Pribilof, and Shumagon Islands, all of Bristol Bay, and most of the Alaska Peninsula, engulfing our entire region. When the proposal was made public, letters and resolutions in opposition to the proposed sanctuary came pouring in from local tribes, communities, and other groups. I'm not aware of any local support for the PEER proposal. In the end, the process worked, and in January 2015, NOAA deemed the Aleutian Islands proposal not sufficient. In October of last year, 2016, a much smaller sanctuary, less than 3,000 square nautical miles, was proposed by the City of St. George. The proposed St. George Unangan Heritage National Marine Sanctuary would create a sanctuary 30 miles seaward from the island of St. George, one of the Pribilof Islands, except towards their neighboring island of St. Paul to the north, where the boundary would only extend 20 miles, and there would be a buffer zone around the St. George Harbor to allow for development there. But besides the City of St. George, other local entities had mixed reaction, including opposition to that proposed sanctuary. So in January of this year, NOAA added the St. George Sanctuary to the inventory of nominations for consideration, and the City of St. George has been outreaching to other community members to say that a St. George Sanctuary would not negatively impact the harbor expansion or local fisheries. The process to nominate national marine sanctuaries is a public process that necessarily includes local stakeholders, and that's a good thing. However, the process would be strengthened by requiring initial involvement in proposal submission by local community groups that would be most impacted. Regional fishery management councils must be consulted prior to designation, but in the North Pacific, the council is already the right management authority, doing the work supported by communities, protecting the marine environment while providing research and educational opportunities. Thanks for your consideration. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. Mr. Hickman.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Sullivan, and Ranking Member Peters, thank you for having me here today, members of the committee. Captain Scott Hickman, I'm a 30-year professional fisherman in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm a volunteer. I have the heart of a volunteer. Started when I was 18 years old, and I volunteered to serve my country in the Marine Corps. I sat on numerous advisory panels for the Gulf Council, as well as serving on the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary Council as the recreational seat. For centuries in the Gulf of Mexico.
For the record, we have a couple Marines on the dais here, so we're liking your testimony already.
Overall, Semper Fi, sirs. For centuries in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico, thousands of men and women for countless generations have responsibly and sustainably accessed, while wisely harvesting the bounty of both the Gulf's fisheries and our energy resources. Until just the last few years, the U.S. government has practiced a proven and balanced multiple-use management policy for the America's people's resources in the Gulf of Mexico. Today, there are thousands of fishermen and oil rig workers offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, carefully and safely working to simultaneously harvest a tiny portion of the resources while responsibly providing the protections necessary to assure there will be plenty of resources for tomorrow. The non-harvestable resources are equally important and must be protected from overfishing and unfortunate oil spills seen in countries around this world. Care comes in many forms, some from responsible regulations, but more from engaged stakeholders, working to protect and responsibly manage resources in nationally significant places. That's why I volunteered and currently serve on the council. Many other fishing industry leadership roles and members do these same tasks day to day and work hard for these sanctuaries. We must select only places that are truly nationally significant to all of our folks in the United States. The federal agencies charged with regulating and managing multi-use activities must be sensitive to the balance of protecting and enhancing American jobs in our coastal communities, just as much as protecting marine life from overfishing and significant oil destruction. The National Marine Sanctuaries Program is a critical part of finding that balance, but only if the stakeholders in the Gulf of Mexico are part of this process. That is why the National Marine Sanctuaries Law created advisory councils of broad stakeholder groups for each sanctuary. For the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, there are 8 stakeholder groups represented on the council, along with non-voting agency representatives. Over 20 men and women that do an amazing job of educating and listening to one another to collaborate in developing solutions. Federal management in the Gulf of Mexico is so much better for the dedication and commitment of these SAC members. In 2007, the SAC recommendation recommended a boundary expansion, now called Alternative 2, that is over 100 square miles smaller than the NOAA preferred Alternative number 3 recommended today. The current SAC is working cooperatively to make an additional boundary expansion recommendation, anticipated in 2017 this year. Sadly, we have been marginalized in the current process. In February of 2015, the NEPA process caused the Office of National Marine Sanctuary staff to go behind closed doors to develop the draft environmental impact statement and recommendations. This should be amended to have SAC members involved in the DEIS process and development. The 2007 SAC recommended the additional of 6 banks with a slight alteration of the existing 3. But staff's preferred alternative added 6 additional more banks to the 2007 recommendation with more arbitrary boundaries encompassing twice as much area, leaving many areas off limits to fishing and drilling as it is proposed. Interagency coordination for platforms to be reefed in place is consistently delayed, often over 2 years. When finally reefed in place, hopefully late this summer, High Island A389 will be the first artificial reef in a national marine sanctuary. We are excited to see this platform become a success story in artificial reefing, home to many, many thousands of marine creatures. In my view, and recommended by the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, the areas known as BOEM no activity zones could be limits of any boundary. Lastly, I hope you will study and embrace the SAC recommendations of 2007 and 2017, and therefore help us make the best decisions on this expansion when the Commerce Secretary makes his final formal recommendation to the Congress. Thank you for inviting me to testify. This has been a true honor and a humbling experience, and to testify before this body, the Senate. It would be a great honor and privilege to answer any of your questions after my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Hickman, and the ranking member, who's a Navy veteran, reminded me that the Marines are a part of a department of the Navy, so I'm just going to include that for the record here to try and be bipartisan and show inter-service respect.
Appreciate that.
Our next witness is Captain O'Brien. Sir, you have the floor.
Well, I'm an Army man, so I probably only get 3 minutes. Chairman Sullivan, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the privilege of being here today. My name is Jeremiah O'Brien. My home port is Morro Bay, California. I'm currently the Vice President of the Morro Bay Commercial Fishermen's Organization. I'm on the Board of Directors of the Morro Bay Community Quota Fund, and I am a member of the Harbor Advisory Board in the City of Morro Bay, and also a 37-year commercial fisherman. For the general public who only see sanctuaries as being to preserve ocean health, but who have little knowledge of sanctuary management actions, sanctuaries are a positive, and there is high support. To their credit, sanctuaries are good at inspiring care of the ocean, a worthwhile goal. However, for those who are engaged directly with sanctuary managers over the resource management, sanctuaries have a mixed scorecard at best. By their actions, sanctuaries have created a difficult relationship with recreational and commercial fishermen in particular. Difficulties arise from the lack of clarity between the Magnuson-Stevens Conservation and Fisheries Management Act and the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, both of which allow for the creation of fishing regulations. For sanctuaries, this power has emboldened them, particularly over habitat issues. For fishermen and fishery management, the fact that sanctuaries can overrule the Regional Fisheries Management Council, with 8 national standards serving as the Council's guide, is disconcerting. and not at the best interest of ocean health. Sanctuaries, on the other hand, have weak science capabilities and poor self-serving public process. On what basis will a sanctuary overrule science-based management of a regional management council is a question that we always have. And I hope that Congress will make it clear that the Magnuson-Stevens Act is the nation's law for fisheries and habitat management. Another major problem are the interpretations by sanctuaries program leaders. Now I'm going to throw this in off script, that I've heard testimony from various people who are having significant success with their sanctuaries, but that doesn't mean that each and every one carry the same management practices. So in this case, we are not having success. Another major problem are the interpretations by sanctuary program leaders of the terms sanctuary and protection, interpreted to mean steadily limiting human uses of the marine resources. One only needs to look at the charter for the Sanctuaries Advisory Councils mandated for the use by the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries to see how the bent towards the preservation, not the conservation of resources, occurs. The lean towards preservation directly caused the Monterey and Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuaries to lead efforts to create no fishing zones when we were promised that wouldn't happen. Taking the finest fishing grounds away from the historic users. Sanctuary managers are so driven to limit human uses that they violated the principles of ecosystem-based management as well as the Sanctuaries Act to provide comprehensive and coordinated management. They ignored our safety at sea concerns, the effects of displacing fishing efforts, and they refused to consider other fishing and habitat regulations as the no-fishing zones were proposed. Fisheries in California currently are managed by the Pacific Fishery Management Council and National Marine Fisheries Service, and for state fisheries, our Department of Fish and Wildlife. It seems that many NGOs with their own agendas already seek to go around normal fisheries management. And if we add sanctuaries as yet another entity with regulatory powers to contend with, how will it be possible for us to do business or attract others into our business? So sanctuaries only bring their values to the table and not science values. In California, we have 4 national marine sanctuaries with 2 more being proposed. Despite their original designation documents, each one has areas closed to fishing because of sanctuary efforts. Commercial fishermen wonder, is it really the intention of Congress that over 12,000 square miles of California coast, with another 5,000 proposed, be deemed of sanctuary importance? What is so special if everything on the coast is special? Finally, there is the issue of trust. Sanctuary managers cast aside the goodwill of the recreational and commercial fishing communities by violating the promises made to us by NOAA officials and the elected leaders that sanctuaries will not threaten our livelihoods. Through years of cherry-picking science, a lack of transparency and favoring preservationist and inaccurate interpretation of the Sanctuaries Act, fishermen have rationally concluded that the sanctuaries are not to be trusted. Sanctuary management actions have economically harmed the commercial and recreational fishing industries. In my home port area, the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary led an effort that closed almost half of our best fishing grounds in state waters. This is why the proposal for new expanded sanctuaries are being vigorously opposed by fishermen and anglers. The actions of the sanctuaries are not helping U.S. Commerce Secretary Ross in meeting the goal of reaching the nation's dependence on imported seafood. Chairman Sullivan and members of the subcommittee, my written testimony provides numerous examples of concerns I express here today. In addition to this testimony, I can make available to the subcommittee documentation to support any and all of the events that I described. Thank you for considering my experiences with the National Marine Sanctuaries Program.
Thank you, Captain O'Brien, and we will submit for the record all of your written testimony in addition to your oral testimony. I'd now like to turn to Vice Admiral Lautenbacher for your 5-minute opening statement. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Peters and distinguished members of the committee, as well as staff. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd like to go back to the bigger picture for just a minute as we move on. And these comments that I've heard are very disturbing to me, having been in this hearing room a number of times and not heard these kinds of things, okay? So, you know, this is the blue planet. We depend on the ocean. The ocean we came from, this is what it supports us. 20% of the protein for the world comes from the ocean. And the ocean needs to be healthy. The ocean is not healthy right now. And I include that in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes have issues too in terms of pollution and the species and closed beaches, et cetera, et cetera. So we have the need to maintain, to bring this ocean back. As we increase the number of people on this planet, there'll be 9 to 10 billion pretty soon in a couple of generations. We need to feed them, we need to clothe them, we need to house them, we need to do a lot of things. So we have to take into account a whole bunch and range of things to do. Now, the sanctuary program, it's a vehicle that was created by Congress, and it's perfectly right and fitting that Congress review it and reauthorize it as necessary, because things change. And this is a very difficult area. When I first sat in this room to be sworn in, it never occurred to me how much time I would spend on fisheries as the head of NOAA. And I assure you that the head of NOAA spends maybe more than 50 or 60% of the time on fisheries. And what you heard here is one of the reasons and why it's important, why it's very, very important. So we need to figure out how to do this correctly. Now, the concept of the marine sanctuaries is a very good one. The idea is trying to have sustainability, but yet take into account all of the kinds of things that we need to have a viable society that's economically viable, that's going to be sustainable, et cetera, that supports the local people who live and work and need those areas desperately. So I support whatever can do that. And I spent a lot of time trying to do it, and I'm sure the people that followed me did it as well. So I'm there on that. Now, in terms of the designation of it, this is a process that is very thorough. It doesn't mean it can't be corrected or changed. It should be always be reviewed. If there are some things you can do to make it more streamlined and more, shall we say, brokered in a way that everyone considers fair, that would be certainly a good thing to work on. But the fact is that the way we have it today, it takes a long time to create a sanctuary. The processes that NOAA have set up, even to now nominate somebody to even be considered, that wasn't in the process when I was the head of NOAA. And I required people to have really good reason if they were going to come in and have a new sanctuary. I mean, it had to be ecosystem, fisheries. You had to go through the science. Hopefully that's still being done. But that kind of rigor is needed. And I think that NOAA's new process does that, because it requires the community come in with all their information and bring the whole community together, which includes the fishermen as well as the environmentalists and the economic developers of the area. So let me stop on that for a minute. The economic value has been proven. This is $8 billion of development that occurs, and salaries and fallout, if you want to call it, the secondary effects in the areas that have marine sanctuaries. And by and large, when I talk to sanctuaries, I admit I haven't talked lately because I left in 2008. So anyway, the people that lived in those areas liked the sanctuaries, and they liked the system where they participated. Fishermen were on the boards, they had participation before rules were changed. And I might point out that according to what the group told me today, there's only 5 sanctuaries that actually have additions to fisheries rules that haven't been already put in place by the National Marine Fisheries Service from the Magnuson-Stevens. So that's good. With that, let me close. I'm running out of time. I thank you, sir, for your, and I.
Well, thank you,
my
Admiral,
written testimony,
and thank you. This
for
is an outstanding group in terms of differing views. So I wanted to dig into some of the questions. First, there's a lot of focus on just a local input, local stakeholder input. You know, Mr. Weiss, you talked about the peer proposal, which I think, you know, in a lot of our views, that's kind of the worst case scenario where you have a group that's not from Alaska, for example, making a NOAA proposal to lock up tens of thousands of square miles of the ocean. Fortunately, I think, as you mentioned, that the process worked there. But what I really want to touch on in terms of questions, really for all the panelists, is the integration of a sanctuary's designation and what goes into it, particularly in terms of rigorous science and data, and how that intersects or either trumps or oversteps with regard to the well-established Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Council process, which is, I think pretty much everybody here noted, works in a very collaborative, stakeholder, science-based approach. And I just want kind of your views, starting with Mr. Weiss, how you see these things working together or maybe not working together, and what more can we do? Because I think the councils under the Magnuson-Stevens Act have a long track record of science-based sustainable management. They certainly do in Alaska. But what's the integration here with sanctuaries, and how do we balance what you said, Captain Hickman, is, you know, the balance and the stakeholder input, which is very front and center on Magnuson-Stevens, but might be lacking in the sanctuaries designation. And I'll open that up to all four of you, because I think all of you touched on it in your testimony. Starting with Mr. Weiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know about the North Pacific Council process, and I know that all their work is about balancing those 10 national standards. They use the NEPA process, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act. I don't know that the Sanctuaries Act employs all those. Perhaps the other gentlemen do know that, but
I don't think it does, which is part of the challenge.
well, I believe that the council process is working.
Yes.
And is probably should be the controlling authority on these.
Yes, sir.
Captain Hickman.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll address your question in two parts. First off, you know, I look at the National Marine Sanctuary as like Yellowstone National Park. I mean, it's to be a National Marine Sanctuary, it needs to be a one-of-a-kind place. And you know, what is nationally significant? I think that's the question when we start going and diving into a lot of this. The Flower Garden Banks are nationally significant. There's no place like it. It's an amazing place. Two, as far as stakeholder input or stakeholder involvement, to get to that point, we've got to have the ability for the local folks, the volunteers, the people from industry, to be able to have some type of weight in the recommendations. Currently, as like Flower Garden Banks, we had a recommendation that would work for all the user groups, oil and gas, fishing, diving, all these folks, and the agency went with something totally different. And, you know, it would be similar to the Yellowstone National Park coming and saying, you know what, we're going to draw a buffer zone 20 miles out from Yellowstone National Park into these ranches, and we're not going to let you do anything in there. And even though it's the property of the people or the property of the country. And that's where we've got to have grassroots folks that have a say-so in this. And currently, the way that the act is we don't have the ability, or we don't have, our voice doesn't have a weight.
Yeah.
And we can recommend something, but then they go and do something totally different, like what just happened with the Flower Garden Banks expansion. We want to expand that Flower Garden Banks into these other areas, but we want to do it right.
Yeah.
In the way that stakeholders can live with it, and that's not the way it happened.
Captain O'Brien, do you have any sense, again, on that question at MSA, and same to you, Admiral? I'll pose that. It's a really critical question here.
In our experience, they have used, the Monterey Bay, particularly as well as the Channel Islands, have used their influence. And their direct participation in creating no fishing areas. Now, when in the state was determined to create some no fishing areas along the coast of California. It extends the entire coast, nearly 1,000 miles, the coast of California. Now, so there's a staggered group of no fishing areas along the coast now, implemented by the state, but influenced by the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary particularly. They used their influence and participated. I have a letter here from them thanking the state for their participation. I believed it was included in your packets, and in that, 5 times, in the very first page of the letter, they said, thank you for our participation. Well, when they were closing these areas, the Blue Ribbon Task Force was in charge of designing these particular areas for the coast, for our section of the coast. They, Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary indicated that it was not strict enough. They needed more. So they did, and they were successful in closing even more areas to both recreational and commercial fishing, which I can't tell you the ways that we, by the way, did participate in that. Myself and a very good friend and my wife in particular participated in that and designed some of our own creations. We ended up losing a massive amount of productive area. The ocean's very vast, as everybody here knows, but certain areas are very productive, certain areas are non-productive, and always will be because of just like the land, the desert doesn't have a lot of wildlife, although it has some very good wildlife, and the ocean is very much the same. So in any case, our success with the acting with the sanctuaries has been nearly zero. The Sanctuary Council, in which is an advisory, and I highlight that word, to the sanctuary itself, is all except certain positions such as area harbor masters and so forth. It's all appointed positions. Well, in one instance, for example, we were appointing a very lovely lady, Kathy Fosmark. The fishing industry supported Kathy for the fishing seat, and that position was opposed because the sanctuary director did not feel that she really represented the fishing industry. Well, Kathy's 2 children are fishermen, her husband is a fisherman, her dad is a fisherman, and she was supported by every fishing group in the state. But they said they didn't feel she really supported the fishing industry. We did finally get her in after going through many lengths, politically and so forth, to twist the arm of the director. So this is just one of the many, many cases, but we have had very, very poor luck in talking to them.
Let me, Admiral, thoughts real quick. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Peters here for his questions, but just on that, you were at NOAA, that integration of the MSA and sanctuaries designation, very important, critical, really, that Congress take a look at it. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I spent a lot of time on Magnuson-Stevens too, and it's a challenge. But the bill that we have today that we worked on and is in force is doing well. So I'm a big supporter of Magnuson-Stevens as it is. The Secretary of Commerce also has the same authority to appoint people to the fisheries councils. So kind of the buck stops at that point. But the fact is, cutting to the chase, is that the way it's set up now, the National Marine Sanctuaries Act gives them control over the fisheries, so they trump whatever the fisheries.
So is it kind of veto power over the
so if the
MSA
council
process?
Yes, if they can't come to agreement, et cetera, and they try hard to talk and back and forth, in the end they can't come to it. I had a couple of situations like that and was able to arbitrate,
right.
Mediate. I put mediate. I got both people to agree in a couple of cases where they could manage what both sides agree. But there are differences. And at some point, you have to have somebody that's authoritative that makes, or some process that makes it. So I will tell you that that is a difficult challenge in working it. The laws don't always mesh. They have various twists and turns in them, and that's one of them, and you're hearing the results of it today.
Thank you. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Ellenbacher, follow up on some of the comments that you made. First, I want to thank you for your service as both a naval officer and as a former NOAA administrator. Appreciate your service to your country. In your testimony, you talk a great deal about the extensive public process, robust community involvement from all sectors, all sorts of stakeholders. I mentioned that briefly in my comments from my experience in seeing what happened up in Thunder Bay in Michigan. You mentioned the authorization over fisheries, but it's my understanding that there's a process before it gets to the sanctuaries. Would you elaborate on whether or not that's really something that a sanctuary is going to do to take over that kind of fishing regulation, or where would that be in the process? Walk me through that.
Well, the Magnuson-Stevens rules apply, so to start with, and the sanctuary gives marine sanctuaries hierarchy or bureaucracy provides the opportunity for the fishery people to set what they want and set the draft rules, so to speak, the draft rules that will
That's
affect.
first. They get the first bite at the apple?
They have first bite at the apple, the draft rules. And then it's looked at by the sanctuary people. And if it's not enough, then they go back and they talk and they talk and they talk and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So it can go on for quite a while. Generally speaking, it comes to a conclusion. And obviously, I haven't been around since 2008, so there's some things that are going on today that maybe haven't reached what I would call an amicable solution from both parties.
But from your experience, the attempt is to find the parties to come
The
together.
attempt is to bring people together, and the attempt is to make sure before it even gets started that you have the basis on which to make a decision, make a decision that people agree to.
Right. Which is the quote that I gave from the Commerce Secretary, that unless you have all local stakeholders, state stakeholders together, a marine sanctuary is not likely to be successful. This is not about railroading, folks. It's
Yes,
about
sir.
trying to bring everybody together
It is.
to embrace the concept. And usually there is opposition on the front end, as we
There is.
had in Michigan, but over time, those agreements are made, and folks hopefully see the success of the sanctuary if it is indeed successful.
That's why it takes years
Right.
to create a sanctuary, actually.
Yeah, this is a very long and laborious process. Captain O'Brien, your comments about Monterey, I want to have you elaborate on those, if you would, please, sir. And it's my understanding that Monterey Bay has done work to promote commercial fishing. They've created a seafood cooperative called Real Good Fish. They're creating oral histories on fishing tradition, implementing education programs. And to my understanding, they have never promulgated any fishing regulation. Is that accurate?
Congressman Peters, that is absolutely not accurate as far as regulation goes.
As far as the sanctuary, now I understand the state of California and the Marine Fisheries Service, that they were the ones that did these regulations. It wasn't the sanctuary itself.
No, the sanctuary actively participated. Now, I think we have to go to a little history with our sanctuaries. As I said, each and every sanctuary is different. And I'm thrilled, and I think that a sanctuary in your area, if it's working well, it's a wonderful thing. And in Mr. Hickman's case here, he has also had that experience. We, unfortunately, have not. So one might be good, one might be bad, one might be in between. We, unfortunately, are suffering, I believe, with some of the worst management problems. I'm not saying the sanctuaries are bad. I'm saying the management problems are bad. So here's, I'm not going to read this letter, but this is from the, at this time, was
We can have that submitted for the record
this was submitted, I believe, to you.
without objection.
Yeah.
So this is written, I won't mention the name, but an acting superintendent of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and it's to the state. And it's a letter thanking them for allowing their participation in the Marine Life Management Act, which is the act that closed our state waters. And briefly, sanctuary staff have appreciated the opportunity to be an active participants in the current effort to designate marine protected areas, MPAs, on the Central Coast. And it goes on. There's many more thank yous of the participants. Well, in the history of this, we thwarted twice the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. That was back in the late 80s and early 90s. And it was designated in 92 with our cooperation, by the way. Leon Panetta, this is the third attempt now, Leon Panetta was assigned to mediate, if you will, between the fishing industry and the sanctuaries. Well, at that time, he had language in their designation document and promises that they would never involve themselves with fisheries management. Well, since then, we have spent, our industry and myself and many others, countless hours and time that we could have devoted to our families and our businesses on struggling with their attempts at management policy. Now, that was only one instance, by the way, that state. There is also, they participated and are currently working with Pacific Fisheries Management Council, or trying to work through them, I should say, in changing some of the essential fish habitat areas, which is another thing that we worked on. We disagree with their position, and they should not be involving themselves in any management.
If I could just have a brief follow-up. So your concern specifically with Monterey Bay is in relation to fisheries regulations, the fact that there are no fish zones. You mentioned problems with the management. What about the management in terms of the other benefits of a sanctuary, whether it's cultural heritage, whether it's protecting marine mammals, whether it's increasing tourism to the Monterey Bay? Certainly sanctuaries have a variety of benefits. Fishing is one of them, or fish management is one of them, but there are a long list of benefits. Would you say they have failed in all of those areas, or simply in the fishing area?
No, I don't believe they failed in all those areas, and there is benefits to a sanctuary designation. I believe what they have done in our case, and I will get back to your question, but in our case, it's a breach of trust. So we had made a deal, they caused a breach of trust. Now, as far as the economics go, I don't believe there is a significant economic benefit. In your case, Congressman, there was. And that, again, is a wonderful thing. Yeah, I have never heard of anybody, and I've been on the coast of California for 40 years now, anybody say they were going to Santa Barbara, to the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, or, for that matter, to Monterey Bay to visit Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. They go there to visit the aquarium, which is no relation whatsoever to the sanctuary. They go there to see the fishing boats and the beautiful bay. The sanctuaries are a wonderful thing if they follow what Congress, I believe, originally had designed them for. Involving themselves in management policies should not be their job. That's why we have the Magnuson-Stevens, and we shouldn't try to overlap two different.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Captain.
Well, thank you, Captain O'Brien, and I want to thank the witnesses again. Senator Peters and I are heading back to the Armed Services Committee. We have a markup of the annual defense bill right now, and in a show of strong bipartisanship, I'm going to hand the gavel off to my colleague from Massachusetts, Senator Markey, for questions and to close out the hearing. So I want to thank Senator Markey for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much.
And thank again the witnesses. Thank you very much.
And thanks to Ranking Member Peters and thank all the witnesses. And it looks like I'll be the final questioner, so let me just get right to it. Earlier this month, I met with a remarkable constituent, Kevin Powers, who was named the 2017 Sanctuary Volunteer of the Year for his contributions to the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. His work with an ongoing seabird survey is helping to understand the food web necessary to support migratory birds as well as whales, dolphins, fish, and other sea life. He has provided me with a letter on his work in Stellwagen, as well as the broader contribution that Stellwagen makes to the coastal economy of Massachusetts and to understanding and protecting our incredible marine resources. And by unanimous consent, I will ask that this letter be included in the record. Dr. Lautenbacher, how do marine sanctuaries, with their citizen science support, help scientists from NOAA and other research institutions better understand the ocean and our marine resources?
The sanctuary office itself has a number of experts that are involved and understand ecosystems, understand fisheries management, understand the various factors that are involved. So there's a good deal of science that goes into understanding it. There also is a good deal of conversation and connection with the local experts who are out there in the water with fishermen and people who are with the local universities. So there's a web and a connection of people trying to provide the best information available at the time. And it can come from a variety of sources, as I've just mentioned.
Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary in Massachusetts was just named the #1 best place to see aquatic life by USA Today. Nearly a decade ago, a study found that tourists spent more than $125 million to travel to and visit the Stellwagen Sanctuary in 2008. How, in your experience, Admiral, do marine sanctuaries contribute to the coastal economies of communities they are nearby?
They're enormously effective. The total that we have is about $8 billion a year in terms of development and providing, additional income and secondary effects in the coastal areas where they are. So overall, I can't claim that everyone is equal, but overall, that's what they get. And normally, things like recreational fishing and commercial fishing does even better. You're into the $100 million, $150 million range for a year or so that you're getting in these various areas. It's a reasonable, we're talking serious money. It's not something to throw away. And that's why these gentlemen are here.
So in your opinion, is it in America's interest to have a system of marine sanctuaries and protected areas, Admiral?
Yes, it is. It is in our interest. It is in the world's interest. It is in our interest as well, definitely.
Based on their studies of where whales are congregating, Stellwagen Sanctuary staff and NOAA have partnered with the International Maritime Organization to redirect the Boston shipping lanes and protect endangered whales off the coast of Massachusetts. The shift cuts the risk of vessel collisions with critically endangered right whales by an estimated 58% and all other baleen whales by 31%. Dr. Lautenbacher, do marine sanctuaries generate information about the ocean and marine life that is important for commercial activities as well?
Yes, they do. And they accept it from the local sources as well as their own experts, or at least they're supposed to. Okay, I'm speaking for the time that I was there, since I left in 2008. I'm sure that there are still some very well-meaning people running the organization, but that's the idea. The idea is to get the information from the fishermen, from the people who are on the water, and the people who use it for various purposes, whether it be recreation or for whale watching or recreational fishing. All of that counts.
And in your testimony, you mentioned that, quote, the ocean today is not healthy. From your perspective as a former NOAA administrator, how do marine sanctuaries help the ocean regain its health?
They help by having a structured regime that's monitored by a management staff as well as the advisory board and the people that are there and the good folks that you listen to that are sitting next to me that are using those sanctuaries. Now, having that managed process, and if you go back and look at most of every paper that I've seen that's responsible, if you're able to control to a certain extent fisheries at the right level, you can re-stimulate even areas which have been fished out, supposedly. You can't go too far because you store the chain, the food chain, food web, which is very hard to restore once you do that, like it's happened in Canada. But in the United States, we've not reached that point yet. But still, if you preserve areas and say reduce or at least monitor, and the National Marine Fisheries Service does that and it's set up, you will regain the structure of the fishery. And so you can actually recover based on the kinds of rules that are set up if they're set up carefully and they're monitored.
The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record. Upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. We thank each of the witnesses for their participation here today. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you all for your
Thank you, sir.
cooperation and your help.